Okay, just wanted to give a couple of updates since I posted this tutorial. A couple of things have come up and I was reminded of a couple things and I thought of a couple other things. So fairly briefly, I just want to cover a couple additional things. So let's go over to Soundminer. So I think one of the things that I wanted to point out and recommend is that obviously if you're going to start playing around with the workflows and rebuilding file names, that you want to be a little bit careful and cautious. The workflows are really powerful, but because they're powerful, it's possible to sort of have them do things you weren't expecting. And so I would give you two tips. One is to, just before you start working on a bunch of files, make sure that you've embedded all the metadata to preserve exactly where you were. That way, if I came in here and I made some changes and I ended up actually deleting something that I wanted and I got out of sync somehow and I did something and I just realized I need to start over, I can simply select all these files, right click and say rescan selected. It'll read the metadata back out of the files and boom, I'm back exactly where I was before I started. So just make sure that you embed before you start and then don't embed at various steps until you're really, really confident that this is exactly what you want. The second thing I would say to do is to if you want to work with building file names, don't build directly back into the file name field. I know I did that a lot in the demo, but I ultimately had nothing to lose. These were sort of files I was preparing just for the purpose of the demo. So what I would recommend is if you want to work with building file names and experiment with that a bit, pull up a field that's likely to be empty. In this case, I'll pull up user comments, and I'll just have that next to the file name. And now if I wanted to start doing some experimenting with, for example, field building, and I'm going to show this off next. This is another tip that was I was reminded of by Justin. Then I could basically work and build the field into this temporary field, right? So user comments. So I'm not committing to anything at this point. I'm not actually changing the original file name. But now if I got this built how I wanted it, and I said, okay, that's exactly what I wanted, now I could simply come in here and do a copy field and copy the user comments to the file name. And at this point, I would basically, when I ran this, bypass this, now I'm copying this user field over to the file name. So I can commit to the file name at the very end of this process once I'm really confident that this temporary one that I've built is correct. And certainly in the demos, I was using undo a lot. And I want to just point out that undo works and it should be pretty safe, but some of these workflows and some of these steps you might be taking might be doing multiple actions and you may not be able to undo all the way back to where you started. Hence the need to embed so that you have a fail-safe. You can always just restore exactly from where you were. One other thing I just wanted to point out real quick, I did a lot of finding and replacing during the demo. And in some of those cases, I realized afterwards that I could have very easily just said remove words. And because some of the things I was doing were just removing a single word from the beginning of a field, like removing the words Sennheiser, Sony, and Sheps from the beginning of the microphone field. In that case, it was one word in each of those that I was removing. I could have just said remove one word from the beginning of microphone. And so I just want to point out that, this would have been actually a faster way to do it. Part of the reason I do the find and replace is that it's less likely to sort of remove something that I don't want. Even if I have to duplicate this a few times and enter multiple terms, at least I'm fully aware of exactly what it's doing. So even though in that case I told it to remove Sheps and Sony and Sennheiser, at least I was sure that it wasn't going to be removing the first word of every single thing in that field in case there was something else besides these three that I was missing. So even though it's slightly more cumbersome, it's also a little bit safer, in my opinion, to sort of use these multiple find and replaces. Then you have just a little more control over it. I wanted to point out one thing about uploading metadata that I think I failed to mention in the video. Not anyone can upload metadata. If you want to upload metadata for your particular manufacturer, for your own company, you need to get a key file from Justin at Soundminer. And this file will allow you to update metadata under your manufacturer name, but nobody else's. So when I come here to the hammer and wrench and I go to the debug menu and I say upload metadata, I have to have the file that will allow me to update that. So I'm not allowed to update metadata for any other vendors but myself. This is a good thing. It means that somebody else can't go in and screw up your metadata and post a bunch of things that would screw up things for your users. But it does mean that right out of the box, you won't be able to update metadata without first talking to Justin and getting a key file made, or I'm not sure exactly what he's calling it, but it's a small file that he'll send to you. You put it in a certain location and it unlocks the ability for you to upload metadata for a specific manufacturer name. So just wanted to make sure that that was clear. When I was working, showing off the workflows, I also missed one workflow that Justin pointed out, which is a good one, and it's one that I just don't really use, and so somehow I just skipped over it. But it's this one, assign from meta tag. So for people who don't know what meta tags are, there is a window in Soundminer, and it's called the meta tag editor. And what this one allows you to do is to specify for certain fields several choices. So for example, if I put here library, I can say Tim Sounds 1, Tim Sounds 2. And if I wanted to, I could add another one, Justin's Sounds. So I can basically pre-populate a list of things that I'm likely to use a lot. One certain common thing that a lot of people would do is to come here to microphone. And if they were an avid recordist and they used a lot of different microphones and they wanted to keep track of them, they could do something like this and sort of build up a list of these. So these are called the meta tags, and you can build for any field a series of them. And you can build for almost all of the fields that you would want to have recurring information. So manufacturer, location, things like that. You can sort of pre-build this list. And if you have some of these, for example, microphone, let me just add one more. I'll just put Chef's XY. So I have 2 microphones now sort of pre-built into this list. Well, this workflow here called assign from meta tag would allow me to say, and it only shows me here the fields that have meta tags assigned. So it says microphone, and here's my list, and I can simply choose this. So this is sort of like the category assign, but allows you to sort of pre-build a list that you would use over and over again for various fields. So in this case, I go to library, there's my 3 options that I sort of pre-built into it. So this is a pretty good one for people who do recurring things a lot. It allows you to, leave this up, and then as you ran the workflow, you could just simply change it to this or change it to this. And when you ran this workflow, it would set that really quickly. So if I run this on all, you can see library will become Justin Sounds. If I do it to this, it becomes this. So instead of having to remember to type in a new one each of these times, I can sort of pre-build my own set of lists. That's what the meta tag list is, and that's what assign from meta tag does. Okay, so lastly, I want to mention something that I didn't mention at all in the demo, and Justin pointed this out as well. And it has to do with field building, which was something we touched on in the demo. But there is a whole other set of options for field build, which is quite clever and quite powerful, and it's worth mentioning, especially if you're going to be building new file names, as some of these options can basically take the place of some of the workflows and allow you to build some really complicated fields using field build. So just to show you how this works, if I call up the workflow, actually I'm going to switch again to a view that just shows the file name, and then I'm going to call up user comment, which is empty, just so that I can build from one to the other one, so that makes more sense. So I'm going to come here to field build, and I'm going to clear this out. We'll set this long again. So if I say I want to take the file name and build that to user comment, basically you'll see that if I run this, it's simply going to make a copy of the file name, right? Nothing has changed. I've said just use the file name in its entirety. But you have the ability to actually specify some other things here that are quite clever. So I'm going to undo so this field is blank. And I'm just going to give you one example, then I'm going to sort of show you the full list of them. But if I put a :NC, which stands for no caps or no capitalization, and run it, then watch what happens. Basically, it lowercases every single thing in the process of building this new field. So it's the same as taking here and pulling out change case and, pulling this out and saying lowercase before I ran this field build. But I can do it right in the process of the field build itself, which is pretty cool. So there are quite a few of these sort of additions you can put on here. I'm not sure the technical term for what Justin is calling these, but you can actually find them here in the preferences if you go to transfers, and here where you click naming scheme, if you click this information, you'll get a drop down of them here. But they're a little hard to read sometimes. They're kind of small. So what I did was I went to our Google Drive, and let me just open this up and show you. And I'm going to go into Utilities, and I'm going to go into Soundminer Workflows, and I made this document here called Field Build Options. If you double click this, what you'll see is a list of the sort of options you can use. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. The options are here on the left. This is the actual definition of what it does, and then I try to come up with sort of an example to make it a little more user-friendly to explain exactly what's going to happen. So just to show you, I sort of grouped them into the things that are common. So here's a bunch that will remove things. So NV will remove vowels, NS will remove white spaces, which are spaces and certain other carriage returns, I believe, things like that. Remove all non-alphanumerics, so remove things like pluses, commas, underscores, dashes, right? Anything that's not a number or letter. Remove a leading and trailing space. And unlike the workflow, this will actually remove multiple spaces at the head and the tail. So if you had 8 spaces as a leading spaces, this little option will actually successfully remove all of them in one fell swoop. This one is quite clever. This one will basically find any space and replace it with whatever else you want. And I'll show you a couple examples of these things in a second. Here's the ones that can place capitalization to all caps, no caps, or capitalization, or title casing, basically this means. WC is title casing. This P is interesting. It has to do with prioritizing in the build itself what fields will get trimmed before other fields. So you can specify a priority to make sure that a certain field isn't trimmed or others are trimmed before this. I'll show that in a second. You can do things like specify the total length of a string, things like that. I'll show that off. You can also use these for truncating, basically. I'll show those. And then you can actually just find and replaces directly in there, and I'll show some of those as well. So let me undo again this build, and let's start looking at a couple of these. So if I build the file name, but I tell it to remove all vowels, basically NV, into the user comments, you'll see that what I get is basically every vowel is basically removed. These are shortened as much as they can by removing all these vowels. So see that none becomes NN at the end. Now, I don't know that you would want to do this very often, but if you had a particularly long file name and you really wanted to truncate it, but still have something that might be readable somehow, this one would work for that. Remove all white space, NS. So if I run this one, basically, you'll see that it's removed all of the spaces in the file name, right? Everything's just run together, no spaces are left. And I should point out that you can string multiple ones of these together, so I can say no caps and no spaces. So when I do this, it basically lowercases everything and runs everything together. Now this is a fairly useless file name, but just to show again that you can actually string multiple of these options together. AN will remove non-alphanumerics. So when I run this one, you'll see that basically the underscores are gone from the file. And it's just simply removed them. It hasn't substituted them for something else. It's just removed them. So the TN underscore none is simply run together. TT, remove leading and trailing spaces, shouldn't really accomplish anything because I don't think I have any. But if there were leading spaces, so let me actually just introduce some and show you. So I'm going to put a whole bunch of leading spaces on this file name, and I'm going to put a bunch over here. And now when I run this on all of them, you basically see it's removed these leading spaces in the new build here. And again, this one will remove as many leading spaces or trailing spaces as you have, this TT. So remove illegal, basically, I've added a colon to the end of this. It might be a little difficult to see, but there's a colon at the end of this after the word none. And because I have IL specified here after the file name, when I run this, you'll see that it removes that at the end of none, right? This colon is an illegal character according to the rules. So because I've said remove the illegal characters, in this new build, it's gone ahead and stripped out that one. And it would strip out other things like slashes and different things like that as well. So next I want to show the substitute all spaces with this string. So in this case, I'm going to type SS, SS, dash. So if you see these rules over here, it says don't type the greater or less than symbol when it's giving you the example. So you simply type SS and then directly the character that you want to use. So in this case, I basically typed SS dash, which says replace all spaces with dashes. And so now if I run this, what you should see is dashes everywhere that there were spaces, right? So it didn't change any of these underscores. It didn't change anything else, just every place that it found a space. And again, I could have said SS, exclamation point if I wanted. And you'll see that this will basically do the exact same thing. Now substituting exclamation points in for every space. So again, we've already seen the capitalization ones, but I'll just show you really quick. AC for all caps. As it builds the new field, it capitalizes everything. Do that. WC for word cap or title cap will capitalize the beginning. Now that's exactly how this is already, so it doesn't look any different. But you can see that it did take the TN and it title capped it. It took the second one and it put it to lowercase because that's technically what title casing does. and NC for no capitalization. Instead of LC for lowercase, it's just NC, no capitalization. We'll basically lowercase everything. As you can see here, every single word's been lowercased. Okay, I want to show off this idea of prioritizing the fields on a field build next. So what I'm going to do is I've told it to basically build the user comments field, which is here, using the file name, a space dash space, and then the effects name. And I've told it you can go up to 255 characters long. So I'm going to pull this out so I have plenty of room. And when I build this, you'll see that it's basically taking the file name, it's putting it there, then space dash space, and then what's currently in the effects field. So if I go back to view here, you can see this is the effects name. So this is this part of this field that's happening here. So I go back here, turn back on user comments, and pull this out. So you can see what it's done. Now, I'm going to basically leave it here, but run this again and start removing this length down just to show you what will happen. So let's say I'm going to limit this to 100 characters long. Watch probably around here, and let's see what happens. You can see this starts to get noticeably shorter, right? And it's simply removed from the end. It just went ahead and truncated down to make this 100 characters. Or if I put, 75 characters, again, it's just removing from the end to basically preserve in the same order here, file name, then effects name. So it's just coming back to the end and starting to cut backwards and remove that. So let me build this back out longer. Let's say, for example, I want to prioritize the effects name. I really want this preserved. If it's going to have to trim it for the length, I want to say, well, trim it from this part, So what I can do is I can come in here and I can put a colon P and then the number of the priority. So in this case, I'm going to put priority 2, and the effects name, I'm going to put colon priority 1. Now, one little tip is you don't actually even need the P. I can simply put a colon 1 and a colon 2. And what I'm actually saying is now, as I change this number and you're forced to trim this sort of concocted field that we're building, then trim here first, basically until this is gone, and then, start trimming here if you have to. So now, when I run one, if I'll put this to 100, watch what happens. I'm going to select all. Pay attention here, because what should happen is it should start to remove from here backwards, right? It should preserve this entire string. Hallway, thin closet door should be preserved. And when I type 100, that's exactly what happens. So it's just started to remove as much of the file name in this build as it needed because the priority was set to second. So effects name took priority over the file name, so it started to trim it that way. So in this case, if I go here and I say truncate it to 50 with those prioritizations, basically, again, you see that it's slaughtered the file names. There's some things left, but it's basically tried to preserve all of the effects names and trimmed everything that it needed to off of the file name. So let me just put this back to 255 to see that the priorities won't have any effect. If it can build the entire file name and it doesn't have to trim anything, then these numbers won't hurt you, right? They won't do anything. They'll just be ignored. If I swap these around now and say prioritize the file name over the effects name, and I start to truncate down to, let's say, 75, then it's basically the same as not having the prioritization numbers in the first place, right? The first field is prioritized over the second one, great. Then just start trimming from the back, which is exactly what would happen. I undo and just leave these off. That's exactly what's going to happen anyway. Right? It's just going to trim from the back. So again, I just want to point out that if we basically tell it to prioritize the effects name over the file name and I hit run, you'll see that it'll start trimming from the tail of the file name going backwards. So again, pay attention to like this group here. And what you'll see is that the file name starts exactly as it did, and it just removed whatever it needed to give us space to prioritize the effects name. But let's say I wanted to preserve the end of the effects name, whatever it is, and I want to tell basically Soundminer, if you have to trim it, trim from the beginning instead. Well, if I come back here and after the priority 2, I type a colon TS, this basically tells Soundminer trim from the beginning. So basically, if you need to truncate it, truncate from the head instead of from the tail of this field chunk. So now when I run it, you'll see that it's basically preserved the very end of each of these file names, and it just trimmed anything it needed from the beginning to make this rule work, to make this whole length 75 characters. It just lobbed off the beginning of the file name. That's again because we told it to prioritize the effects name first. You can experiment a little bit with this and you'll kind of get a better grasp of it. But it allows you to sort of say, these prioritizations and the truncations basically say, you know, prioritize this field over the other one, and if you have to trim it from the head or the tail. If you leave this TS off, it'll trim from the tail. If you add that, it'll say trim from the head. Okay, there's a flag to specify the total length of the resulting string, so it's very similar to this. But let's say I leave that at 255 and I build the file name just like this. It's exactly as it was. But if I type the LE flag for length and I say 10, it's basically saying don't make a file name longer than 10 characters, and you'll see that's exactly what it does. One thing I want to point out is that the LE string specifies the length of the entire sort of built field or built string. So what it won't do is truncate each separate field. So let me give you an example. If I type file name length 10, and then I type space dash space, and then I type effects name length 10, what you might think it's going to do is take 10 characters of the file name and 10 characters of the effects name. And when I build this, you'll see, no, it's just kept the first 10 from the file name, because the length flag says this is the entire length. So it's exactly the same as this. So it would be the same as taking off these length flags here and telling it to build a total string of 10 characters long. It's going to result in the exact same thing. There is a way to say take a certain number of characters from here and here, and that's to use the X flag. So if I come here and I say $X10, and I come to the effects name and I say $X15, what I'm saying is build a new field with 10 characters from the file name, and it'll count from the beginning, then a space dash space, and then 15 characters from the effects name. Oh, no, because I want to put this back out to 255. So now when I run it, you'll see I get 10 characters of the file name, space dash space, and 15 characters of the effects name. So this one is pretty powerful for building sort of truncated different things, for building an effects name or something like that, or potentially used in building file names. One other sort of variant of this is, instead of specifying the total length of the field, which is the LE flag, or the total length of each component, which is the X flag, there is also basically a way to say force the file name, or force the field, I should say, to a certain length. And that's the I flag. But what the I flag actually does is expands the field out to a certain number of characters, in this case 100, but it does so by padding the beginning of the field with zeros, as many as it needs. So it's a little bit odd, but when I run it, you'll see that basically every one of these is now 100 characters long, and it added as many leading zeros as it needed to accomplish that. I'll be honest, I haven't quite wrapped my head around when you would want to use this, but it's a pretty interesting thing, so I thought I'd show it. Justin will maybe have to remind me why this one exists, because I just can't figure out when on earth I would want that. But it's possible to do with the I flag. Well, the next one I want to show off is how to do a find and replace right within the field build itself. So I'm going to just start again with file name exactly as is. I'm not going to do any alterations. So you'll see that when I run it, I get this exact copy. The file name is being just copied over into user comments, basically, right? But let's say I want to do some replacing of words along the way. So let's look here. Let's say Petaluma, which is the town where I live. Let's say I want to change that in the course of building this new field. Well, there are two flags that you can use. One is :SR for search, and this is basically the find part of it. So what do you want to find? And I want to find Petaluma. It is case sensitive, so I have to type it exactly as it appears in the string, in the file name. And then I put a :RP for replace, and then I type what I want to replace. So I replace it with Los Angeles, right? Now, when I build this new field here, it's going to basically do a find and replace. So when I run this, you'll see that every time Petaluma was listed in the file name, it's now replaced with Los Angeles. Now, you could certainly do that very easy with the find and replace workflow. You could just simply do it before you did this and things like that. I could either come here and do a find and replace in the file name before we did the field build, but then I'm actually changing the original file name. Or I could put this after and replace it in the user comments, right? So it would be a way for me to do it after, and it would accomplish the exact same thing. So if I just put this back to build basically file name, and I bypass this, you see Petaluma is back. And if I undo this and I say, do this, replace it here, this will work. It does the exact same thing. But the cool thing about doing it here is that I can do multiple ones at the same time. So I could type SR Petaluma replace Los Angeles. Then I could just add another one, basically colon search for rain and replace with snow. So I can add as many of these in sequence as I want. And basically you'll see that it now also replaced rain with snow and Petaluma with Los Angeles. So this is a way that you can sort of keep your number of building blocks, much smaller, and you can do some finding and replacing right within this. So let me just get the file name back as it was and build it as it was back into user comments to show you this last set. This last one are called use only right end characters or use only left end characters. These are sort of, to me, the least counterintuitive of them, but I want to try to explain what they do. They basically truncate. They truncate either a certain number of characters off of the field, or they truncate to a certain number of characters. And they're designated with a right and a left version. So if I type :RI 10, watch what happens. This says basically use n right characters. So use 10 characters from the right. So when I run this, basically what I've said is keep the 10 characters counting backwards from the right edge of the file name, or of the field, I should say. So in this case, it's the file name. So it started at the end and it counted back and preserved 10 characters. There's exactly what we have. We have 10 characters counting back from the beginning of this, right? If I type L instead of RI, I say, preserve the first 10 characters of that field. So when I run it, I'm left with the first 10 characters, and it's truncated everything else down to this. The thing that gets confusing is you can also add negative numbers into this, and then it will behave differently. So if I type left -10, watch what happens. Left -10 actually has the effect of truncating 10 characters from the right edge. So it sort of says preserve all the characters starting from the left except for the last 10, if you can think of it that way. So it's basically the equivalent of truncating 10 from the right, even though you're telling it to basically use the left. So the same thing, if I type RI -10, it should have the effect of removing 10 characters from the beginning. And that's exactly what it does. When I run it, it's kept everything else starting from the right backwards. It's kept all of it except for the first 10 characters, which means it's truncated the first 10 characters. So you can see it's taken off Dorwood _H. There's 10 characters. What I'm left with is this. So they're very useful, but they're a little counterintuitive. You just have to kind of try them and remember them. This is a good example of why I'm going to build, for example, into user comments so that I'm not committing myself to anything and I realize, oh, I didn't want that. I wanted this version, the left truncate the last 10 characters from the right. So super powerful, all of these flags that you can do. And again, just remember that you can string as many of these things as you want. So even after I do that, I could tell it to all cap, right? Now everything's capitalized. I could come in here and say NS for no white space, and now it's going to remove all the white space. I could come back in here and put in AN for remove all the non-alphanumeric, and now it's basically going to get rid of all the underscores, right? Now, I don't know why I would want this, but I can do it all with just these flags in the field build itself. And you can string as many of these things together as you want within the sort of field brackets for that field. So again, if you go to our Google Drive, you can see this list. You can get an example of what each of them does, and it's worthwhile coming in and experimenting a bit. If you're doing a lot of complicated databasing, these things are very powerful, and I definitely need to remember to use them more. I always forget about them. So I just wanted to show off those a little bit here and explain them. So that's it. I just wanted to cover those few additional things that I sort of missed on the previous videos, and particularly I wanted to show off those flags in the field build option because they're very powerful. It's definitely an advanced sort of feature, but for people who are doing big crowdsourcing libraries or are compiling a lot of information, they may be really useful to understand. So I hope that helps, and that's it for now.